So the Florida Grasshopper Sparrow is a critically endangered subspecies. They are incredibly cryptic and they spend a lot of their time on the ground. Likely due to their highly cryptic nature, they weren't first described until 1907. They are non-migratory and they spend all of their time on our prairies and pastures. They were once reported as far south as Collier and Miami-Dade counties. However, due to habitat loss, due to land conversion and development, they have been extirpated from all counties except for Highlands, Osceola, and Okeechobee since the 1980s. Due to that habitat loss and range restriction, they were listed as endangered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 1986. Currently, there are 4 monitored populations. 3 of those exist on public lands with lots of dry prairie, and 1 is on the Destiny DeLuca Ranch, which is a working cattle ranch. Likely, there are other breeding populations on adjacent private ranches because we do see routine immigration of unbanded individuals into our monitored populations. Unfortunately, since monitoring began, all of our populations have been declining, and the causes for these declines are still widely unknown. There are lots of factors which have likely played a role, including losing upwards of 98% of the dry prairie ecosystem, changes to the hydrology along the Kissimmee River, changes to fire management, and the introduction of the red imported fire ant. We began monitoring the Destiny DeLuca Ranch in 2015, and since then we've learned how to encourage nest success on a novel working landscape. We perform a lot of intense nest management at all of our monitored sites, including fencing nests to discourage terrestrial predators, lifting them when there is risk of flooding, and eradicating all of the fire ant colonies around each nest. While fire ant eradication has had a huge contributing factor to the population increases we've recently seen at Destiny DeLuca, this site actually also sees routinely high levels of annual immigration of unbanded individuals. You might notice that there's a pretty steep uptick on the purple line representing Three Lakes Wildlife Management Area. And of course, while all of our nest protection strategies are surely contributing to their increased success, that drastic uptick is largely due in part to the contribution of birds that have been released there from our captive breeding program. More than 250 birds have been released onto Three Lakes Wildlife Management Area since the spring of 2019, and about 1/3 of them are integrating into the wild population. So these birds have been pretty well studied, especially their habitat preferences. From the historic literature, we know a few things to be true, that they prefer open areas of bare ground. Like I said, they forage on the ground, so they like to be able to move around uninhibited. And likely because of their affinity for bare ground, they show a high preference for areas that have been burned within the last year. And they definitely stay away from those that are going on 2 or 3 years unburned. And they also stay far, far away from tall trees, which of course are predator perches. And they like to stay far away from trees. I guess that's about that. While we've known that these birds have existed on pasture since about the 1980s, we've never considered it a suitable habitat alternate to dry prairie. We know that low density grazing is not detrimental to their breeding efforts, and that cattle are not a significant source of nest mortality on these working landscapes. However, of course, where there are cows, there is disturbance. And those disturbed habitats have a far greater fire ant densities than the native prairies. So how can these ranches contribute to our sparrow recovery? The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recovery goal aims to have 10 subpopulations, each with more than 50 sparrows. Like I said, currently we only have 4 populations, for the most part, all with far fewer birds than 50. So we would either need to restore lost prairie or investigate other options like these working landscapes. And we do have evidence that these birds are persisting on at least 2 additional private ranches. And of course, that's without any of our nest protection or managing. We know now through our work at Destiny DeLuca Ranch that these birds can be successful on pasture and that they can nest in both improved and semi-native pastures with equal success in both, so long as we are implementing all of our nest protection measures. And we know through our resighting data that annual adult survival is actually higher for birds on pasture than it is on prairie. You can see in the graph on the right that in 2017, when we began our red imported fire ant treatments around each nest, that daily nest survival of nests on pasture became very comparable to those on prairie. So that leads us, of course, to having some questions. First, how does habitat differ structurally between Avon Park and the ranch? Which habitat features seem to be affecting sparrow occupancy? And how do these vegetative characteristics that were considered important before the decline compare to our current findings? So we began our habitat quality data collection. We used a protocol that was developed at Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park. We record data for things like grass and shrub height, percent estimates of ground cover, and distances to nearest trees and structures. And then we categorize each of our points as occupied or unoccupied. And we do that by buffering each survey location by 150 meters and then overlaying all of the GPS points, which we've collected for these birds during the breeding season. And if any point fell within that buffer, it was considered occupied for the purposes of our research. So you can see at Avon Park Air Force Range, we are largely dry prairie. However, at the ranch, we have a lot of semi and improved pasture. And you might be wondering, what exactly do these different ground covers look like? You can see on the right that native dry prairie is categorized by a diverse covering of both woody and grass cover. And improved pasture is going to be largely just one sort of planted non-native grass for grazing, with some native vegetation perhaps persisting through it. And semi-native pasture falls anywhere between those two. So now I'm going to pass it off to Fabi to tell you what we've learned about Florida grasshopper sparrow habitat preferences.
Thank you, Chelsea. I'm going to jump right in since we have a lot to cover. So the first question we wanted to address was, how does habitat differ structurally between Avon Park and the ranch? So for this, we analyzed our data using a generalized linear model and site as our dependent variable. And on this table, we have all the parameters we measured. Bold indicates significant difference between the two sites, and we can see that shrub vertical structure and grass vertical structure were both significantly different between the two sites, as well as percent woody cover, percent herbaceous cover, and distance to tall trees and short trees. So when we look at our graphs here on the right, we can see that Avon Park had a lot more woody cover compared to the ranch, and a lot less herbaceous cover compared to the ranch. Both of these results were expected since, like Chelsea mentioned, the habitat at the ranch is mostly composed of semi-improved and improved pastures, and Avon Park is mostly composed of dry prairie. The two graphs on the bottom, we can see that at Avon Park, distance to tall trees and distance to short trees were both significantly greater at Avon Park compared to the ranch. So to answer our first question, how does habitat differ structurally between Avon Park and the ranch? First, the ranch has a lot more herbaceous cover, again, due to the converted pastures, and then it also has less woody cover, but they also tend to be taller. At Avon Park, on the other hand, there's a lot more woody cover, less herbaceous cover. Also, there's taller grass and greater distances to tall trees and short trees. Next, we wanted to know which habitat features affect sparrow occupancy. For this, once again, we used a generalized linear model and included all of our points from Avon Park at the ranch together, which were a little bit over 180. 42 of those were considered occupied points, and here we have a breakdown of what our occupied points consisted of. We can see that half of them were semi-native, and that the other half were divided between dry prairie and pasture. So we created a total of 29 models with occupancy as a dependent variable, and we had two top models with AICs lower than 2.0. So from our top model, we can determine that sparrow occupancy was best predicted by site, percent herbaceous cover, and distance to nearest tall tree. Notice here that site is maintained, which means that they're selecting for different things at the different sites. So when we look closely at it, here we have a summary of our top occupancy model. And we have our three parameters. We have percent herbaceous cover, we have site, and distance to nearest tall tree. And on this graph, we went ahead and broke it down by site and occupancy. And when we look at the graph for herbaceous cover, the first thing we notice is that, of course, herbaceous cover is a lot greater at the ranch compared to Avon Park. But when we look at our site-specific differences, we can see that at Avon Park, our occupied points had a lower mean than our unoccupied points as far as herbaceous covers goes. On the other hand, at the ranch, occupied points had a greater mean compared to the unoccupied points. When we look at our distance to tall tree, we can see that both sides are in agreement. Occupied points had greater distances to tall trees compared to unoccupied points at both sites. So to address our second question, which habitat features affect sparrow occupancy, we can conclude that at the ranch, birds are selecting for more herbaceous cover and greater distance for tall trees. And at Avon Park, birds are selecting for less herbaceous cover and greater distance to tall trees. Our last question that we wanted to address is, how does vegetative variables identified as important to Florida grasshopper sparrows before differ to our current findings? So to answer this question, we used a paper published by Delaney and Linda in 1994, which describes characteristics of occupied Florida grasshopper sparrow territories and compared it to our own data. So in this graph, we have 3 parameters. So we have herbaceous cover, shrub cover, and bare ground. And our first column is the occupied habitat data from the Delaney and Linda paper in 1994. It's important to note that the study area for this paper was Three Lakes Wildlife Management Area and Avon Park in 1994, both of which are dry prairie. Then next we have our Avon Park data, and lastly our ranch data. So the first thing we want to point out here is that we can see that our herbaceous cover has pretty much remained the same at dry prairie since 1994. And of course, when we compare it to our ranch data, we can see that our herbaceous is much higher. Again, expected since this is a converted pasture. However, when we look at shrub cover, we can see that it has increased over time since 1994. In fact, now shrub cover is most similar to our shrub cover that we have at the ranch. The last thing is looking at bare ground. We can see that bare ground at Avon Park and the ranch are pretty similar and both pretty low compared to the bare ground that we had historically in dry prairie in 1994. So what has changed? We can conclude that dry prairie has definitely changed, likely to changes in fire management. And we also can conclude that there has been some shifts in sparrow occupancy characteristics from what once was known to be good to them before to present day in dry prairie. Additionally, for the longest time, it was believed that birds could not do well in semi-native and improved pastures, and that they were settling for whatever was left. However, there are large tracts of dry prairie that is not being occupied by sparrows. Therefore, they're choosing to be in these working landscapes. So we now know that these birds are showing selectivity for specific parameters in working landscapes, which leads us to think that, in fact, sparrows are more flexible than we originally thought, and that ranches may be the most feasible option for the recovery of the species if we eventually want to have 10 subpopulations. So everything I presented here are preliminary results. There are 1 year of data from each site. There are more seasons of data that we want to collect and also more parameters that we want to be able to measure, but we do have some future directions. Now that we know that sparrows can be successful in working cattle ranches, we plan on creating a management plan to be able to maintain Florida grasshopper sparrows by using this habitat data and our demography data. We aim to create a template that can be implemented at other cattle ranches that can keep ranches profitable. We know that ranching is a large part of the heritage of Florida, so we want to be able to keep them profitable with their cattle operations while still maintaining the sparrow habitat. And lastly, we want to use this management plan to do some restoration. Here on the right, we have a map of the Destiny DeLuca Ranch, and we can see that only 1 out of 4 fields is occupied. So we want to do some restoration within the ranch to increase movement and, of course, the population, but also we want to promote movement to adjacent sites like Kissimmee Prairie Preserve, which is pictured in the blue. So that's it for us, and we'll take any questions.
Thank you very much to both of you. Before we go to questions, Hillary wanted to highlight a conservation story associated with these large ranch lands.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we have a wonderful audience here today. I'm not going to take long, but a couple of weeks ago, a huge conservation success story in Florida. The DeLuca Preserve, the Elizabeth DeLuca Preserve, was the land was donated to the University of Florida with a conservation easement on it, 27,000 acres, to be held by Ducks Unlimited. And I want to give a huge shout out to Reed Bowman, to Fabi, and to the entire Chelsea, the entire Grasshopper Sparrow team, because their data not only provided strong conservation justification, but will help guide future management on that site. So it's really a huge shout out to them. They made an enormous conservation impact here. And we look forward to working with the University of Florida and combining our ecological and knowledge of grasshopper sparrows with their management. Sorry to take your time, but it's so exciting what you did.
Thank you, Hillary.
Thank you so much.
That is wonderful news. We do have time for just one quick question, and then I'm going to email the rest of them to you guys for follow-up for later. We had a question from Betsy Boughton. How does fire regime on the protected sites compare to the ranch?
So on the public properties, burning is more regular. That's not to say that it's always within like the natural occurring fire seasons. A lot of that does happen during the winter so that we can avoid take on grasshopper sparrow territories and nests. The ranch does burn. Unfortunately, the management records are less thorough than they are on the public properties, but they do burn and they do move cows off of those burned areas before returning them so that they can encourage the proper ground cover to come up after those burns.